Welcome back to This Week in Immigration. I'm Teresa Cardinal Brown, Senior Advisor for Immigration and Border Policy at the Bipartisan Policy Center, and I will be filling in for Hanadi Jordan while she is out. We're recording this episode on March 8th, 2023, and this week we are joined by BPC's resident workforce expert, Ben Gittes. Ben is an Associate Director at the Bipartisan Policy Center, focusing on labor market policy. He's going to give us insight into the state of our workforce and the role immigration has been playing. Stay tuned. We're back. Ben, welcome to This Week in Immigration.
Thank you for having me, Teresa. Excited to be here.
Yeah, we're so glad to have you here. So you work at the BPC as an associate director on our economic policy project, but before that, you researched and wrote on paid family leave, the opioid crisis, minimum wage, and immigration at the American Action Forum. So we are excited to get your take on the state of things here today.
I'm excited to give you my take.
Yeah, here we go. All right. So this week, you and I, published the results of a survey that Morning Consult did on behalf of the Bipartisan Policy Center, asking voters their opinions about skilled immigration to the United States. So why don't you tell us what some of the key findings were on that survey?
So, the biggest finding from that survey was simply that Americans recognize the need for high skilled immigration to help grow our economy. Immigration in general is really important to the typical American voter. 77% of American voters find it very or somewhat important. Just the topic broadly find it very important. 76% specifically support highly skilled immigrants coming to live and work in the United States. And 56% believe that highly skilled immigrants help the U.S. economy grow.
So that's pretty impressive. Why do you think that skilled immigration is important to our economy?
It's because highly skilled immigrants bring exactly that really important skills that help produce and innovate. And particularly in our current labor market, where we are facing significant shortages of workers and across all skill levels, but in particular in the high skilled sectors, they can help fill important roles that currently there aren't workers to fill.
Yeah. But, we think of high skilled workers, probably a lot of people think about the tech sector, and there's been some pretty high profile layoffs in the tech sector in recent months, particularly including some of the foreign workers that those companies had sponsored for immigration. Do you think that means that we don't have a need for skilled workers?
No, I think it's important to look at long term trends and, this shortage, these layoffs that we've seen in the tech sector it's largely isolated to a particular sector, and it doesn't necessarily show up in our broader jobs reports. And then over time, this labor shortage problem that we've been experiencing really predates our current era. It started before the pandemic even started. There's a common metric folks look to when trying to understand our labor supply, and that's our job openings. And that was steadily on the rise for the years leading up to the pandemic. Before the pandemic, it was at an all-time high. Then we hit the pandemic. Now we're at an even higher jobs opening level. So this is something that's been going on for a really long time. And the notion that, the last few months of the layoffs in the tech sector might suggest we may not need as many skilled immigrants. I don't think that's necessarily true. Perhaps particular companies or industries may not need as many highly skilled immigrants as before, but we will certainly need them for the long term.
Yeah. So you mentioned this job openings. We can talk about the labor market today. So just today, on the day we're recording this, the Bureau of Labor Statistics released its latest data on job openings. And it said that we had 10.8 million job openings at the end of January 2023. That's down slightly from the 11 million we had in December. But the BLS also reported that at the end of January, we had only 5.7 million unemployed workers. So forget about matching skills, just those numbers don't add up. Our national employment rate is 3.4%, which is the lowest in a decade. And there's specific sectors that are seeing this. So the most openings are in things like hospitality, healthcare, construction industries. Do you is this enough to define a labor shortage? Like, how do we actually understand that term when we look at labor markets?
So the term labor shortage is thrown around quite a lot. But it's important to note that it's not very precisely defined. What these numbers do indicate is that we are having a very tight labor market, where people are switching jobs rapidly. There's very low unemployment, and that gives workers a lot of leverage to define what this this to help contribute to this hot labor market where someone can leave a job and go find another job because they can. But the reason behind that is it is this labor supply problem where labor force participation has been on the decline for a couple of decades now. Now it's been declining since 2000, and then since the pandemic in particular, there was a steep drop in labor force participation where a lot of workers left the labor force, and not everyone has come back. We're still about 3 million workers shy from where we were, and as a result, the number of jobs that employers are looking to fill exceeds the amount of workers that there who are available to fill those jobs. That 10.8 million number you mentioned, it's been around 10.8 to 11.2 million job openings for about a year now. This is something that's kind of stuck around, and that metric of job openings kind of signifies how many more jobs do employers looking to fill than there are workers available for, suggesting a labor shortage, although it's a little bit more nuanced than that.
Yeah, yeah. So, I guess whether or not this is a problem depends on whether you're someone seeking a job or an employer looking to hire. You said, in this kind of a job market, if I'm looking for a job or looking to change jobs, I should be able to do so relatively easily. I mean, that's broadly speaking in the economy. It depends on my personal skills and everything. As you mentioned, it gives employees more leverage, probably negotiating salaries. But what other challenges does this tight labor market or labor shortage, the big discrepancy between openings and people working or looking for work mean for the economy?
So the biggest challenge, kind of stepping back and looking at the broader economy, is that without enough workers to fill those jobs, job growth is slower than what you'd want, and also production, economic output is slower than what you'd otherwise want. And combine that with the challenge that we have a high amount of demand in our economy now. People are spending a lot. The fact that there are enough workers to fill those jobs means that employers have to pay more workers more to fill those jobs, increasing the cost of production. And this is one of the factors that's contributing to this problem of inflation that we've been dealing with for the last year and a half or so. And so, there are many factors contributing to this, but the fact that employers have had to increase wages and have struggled to fill those jobs has been one of the outcomes of that.
Yeah. So you mentioned earlier, compared to February 2020 pre-COVID, 3 million fewer people are participating in the workforce today, according to the US Chamber of Commerce, and I guess they get their numbers from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. But you mentioned some of them. What do we think is responsible for these so-called missing workers?
So I would generally categorize it into two buckets. There's folks who I think are temporarily missing from the workforce, and then there's the permanent leavers. So the folks who are temporarily who left the workforce during the pandemic include people who left for COVID specific reasons. Either they got COVID and had to leave temporarily, maybe they're struggling with forms of long COVID, or they have underlying conditions that would prevent them from going back to the workforce. And then there's a few million workers who are still afraid of the virus itself, and getting or spreading the virus. There's also been a lot of issues related to caregiving, and there was an increase in caregiving responsibilities during the pandemic, where may not be as big of a factor now that schools are open and we've returned to much of our daily life. But during the pandemic, a lot of schools went to remote, and a lot of parents simply had to be flexible and have to stay home to care for someone if they had a remote learning situation. And so a BPC Morning Consult poll found that during the pandemic, 10.6 million people stopped working due to caregiving responsibilities.
Wow.
And then another issue that may have contributed to this is that we had, and again, this may be less of a factor today, but contributed to this kind of lower than anticipated level of labor force participation over this last few years, is that we've had a large amount of fiscal stimulus throughout the pandemic, increased UI benefits, increased child tax credit, stimulus checks. All that has been documented, and research has shown that's resulted in excess savings. And that may have contributed to folks kind of taking a little extra time to find the right work they want, reconsider their priorities of spending time with family, having gone through this big, pandemic that's been challenging for a lot of us. So that's one factor. Those are kind of the temporary things that have gone on over the last few years that we'll hopefully get through. But then there's also a set of permanent factors that are a little bit more troubling, and we have to think about how to counteract. So, one is, and grimly, our Fed chairman, Jerome Powell, pointed out that there are roughly 400,000 people who died during the pandemic who would otherwise be working today. And
Mm.
so that's a big chunk of our workforce who is simply not here anymore. Um, Another thing that happened is that Goldman Sachs estimated that 2.5 million people retired during the pandemic, and 1.5 million of those retired early. So the chances of those folks coming back are less than others. And then lastly, it's important to point out, going back to this long-term workforce participation decline that I mentioned earlier, this has been an issue that has been driven largely by demographics. Just like we had 2.5 million people retire during the pandemic, we've been having people retire and leave the labor force since about 2000, which is when the labor force participation rate began its decline in recent history. And that will continue as long as we have this baby boomer generation. And coupled with that is that we have a declining birth rate. So we don't necessarily have a population that is going to replace those workers in the foreseeable future. And so all of this goes to show that without some form of policy like immigration policy, we're going to see a declining population over the long term, and as a result, slower economic growth.
All right. Well, we're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, we will dive a little bit deeper into how our immigration system can help with the workforce issues. So don't go away. Okay, and we're back. So let's dive right in. So this is an immigration podcast, and I guess we should talk about immigrants in the labor force. So we know that immigrants or foreign-born people, because some of them have naturalized or become U.S. citizens, um, are are in the workforce in the country, and they make up around 17.4% of the overall workforce, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. They are more represented in some of the industries that are seeing the most job openings. So you kind of gotten this a little bit before the break, but how important are immigrants as we look at the labor force overall? And how do immigrants support labor force growth?
So I think it's important to take a step back and look at the overall our US population and economy over the long term. The Congressional Budget Office has pointed out that we have an aging demographic problem in this country and a declining birth rate. And without immigration, our population declines, and so does the economy. So immigration is vital to ensuring that our economy continues to grow over the long term, but also it's immigrants can help grow and resolve our labor force participation problems that we have now. Immigrants have a higher labor force participation rate than native born workers. And it's important that we have this injection of workers so that we continue to ensure that we have productivity in the near term and the long term.
Yeah. So, what are some of the things that you think contribute to immigrants having higher labor force participation rates than native born workers? Is just because immigrants get the job done and they're harder working, or are there more to it than that?
Well, I think a lot of people come to this country because of the economic opportunity that we have. And immigrants are often caring for folks in other countries and sending back money. They're starting their livelihoods here. And yeah, sorry, I don't know if that's going to answer to that
No,
question.
no, that's I think that's a good answer. I mean, one of the things we looked at also is that, immigrants don't have access to some of the same supports that American citizens do, at least until they get their own citizenship, that might allow them to sit on the sidelines. So they can't necessarily get unemployment insurance. They don't qualify for Social Security disability unless they've worked long enough, right? So some of these things are probably things that deter them, from being able to do other things rather than work as well. So it's worth thinking about. We also noted that immigrants tend to be more likely than native born workers to work in service occupations like retail and hospitality, for example, construction and maintenance occupations, and production, transportation of material moving occupations. And those are often lower wage jobs. And we started out talking about the importance of skilled immigration, but does that mean, do you think that we have shortages in those types of jobs as well?
We do. Our labor shortages and labor supply problems has impacted virtually every industry and every occupation. And because we have a large number of immigrants in one occupation doesn't necessarily mean we don't couldn't necessarily benefit from more immigrants in that population or in that occupation. So it's also important to point out that, immigrants can get in an occupation and, over time, generationally, their family can transition to other industries and contribute to other parts of our economy with different skill levels. And lastly, it's not like in these occupations where we have lots of immigrants that there's necessarily native born workers who will be able to replace them if we don't have immigrants there. And studies show that immigrants tend to take jobs complementary to native born workers, and simply because there's less interest in those industries among for native born workers.
Yeah, yeah. So, what structural changes do you think we might need to make to attract or address the lack of workers in these jobs? And one of the things we read about a lot is, oh, automation's going to take all those jobs anyway. Do you think that's likely, or do you think we still are going to need workers in these jobs for the foreseeable future?
I think we'll still need workers in these jobs. Folks have been predicting automation to take jobs for about a century, and it hasn't happened. What's really important is, there are a number of barriers that families face to going to the labor market today that particularly impact lower income, lower skilled workers. Education is one, and it could be as simple as there's issues of education of like financial literacy, soft skills, learning how to interact with people and customers. Reemployment services is an important, and workforce development is a really important factor that is often overlooked in our safety net, but it is associated with a lot of our safety net programs, like unemployment insurance, which I mentioned earlier in the
Mhm.
podcast, has a reemployment service program that is frankly not prioritized enough because we got to help people go back to work. There are steps lawmakers can take to make work pay more, like the and attract workers more into those jobs. So the earned income tax credit is a very important safety net benefit that is targeted to low income households. And because it's associated with work, you need to have earnings to receive it. It results in getting more people into the workforce. Another issue that a lot of low income families face is caregiving. People have children and other family members, maybe elderly family members, that require a lot of their time and attention. It can make it difficult for them to, be nimble or flexible to switch to get a job that may not have predictable hours or be able to stay committed to a job that will have a large amount of hours associated with it. So policies like paid family leave, support for childcare is really important for those families as well.
Yeah. So you're talking about things that aren't immigration. I think it's worth saying, because we've said it before and we should say it again. Immigration isn't the whole solution here, right?
Right.
We're not gonna just like open the doors to everybody and that's gonna solve, like, we do want to make sure that Americans have access to the best work they can and can access the labor market. And your work at BPC covers all of those workforce issues. It's not just related to immigration. Um, and you were talking about sort of the job retraining question, and we going back to sort of the skilled workforce. I mean, one thing that comes up is, how do we help more Americans have the skills needed? Is the skilled workforce shortage um, as much related to getting workers to to be have the skills needed for the jobs, or is it just enough people, or something of both?
It's a whole combination of things, Teresa. So there's also, in the workforce development policy space, there's this whole issue of credentialing and recognizing the skills that people have. And so there's a lot of innovative thinking going on out there that hopefully will that we're working to get, you know, worked into federal policy where how do you verify that a trucker or someone working in transportation has used a certain technology that may be applicable to a whole different industry? Or how do you verify that, you know, in a job like at BPC, I use Microsoft Excel a lot. And how can BPC verify, hey, this guy knows how to use Microsoft Excel? And stuff like that should be applied to a lot of other industries and occupations, so that employers don't necessarily have to rely on an official credential or occupational license or a bachelor's degree to signal that this person is going to be a high quality contributor to their workforce. So that's one issue. The other issue is we simply need more pathways through our workforce development system for folks to obtain, rewarding, good paying careers. One area that we've been thinking a lot about is career and technical education, which is intended for high schoolers and young adults, providing a pathway to a skilled career that doesn't necessarily require going to college. And so there's a whole host of things that are really important for, you know, both native born workers and immigrants who grow their livelihoods here as well, that are important to to help fill these skilled occupations.
Yeah, one thing that we have looked at in the past is particularly needs in the healthcare workforce, and we've seen a lot of departures and retirements in the healthcare workforce, and that tends to be one of those places where you see a lot of immigrants in the workforce. But particularly healthcare licensing um, is a big barrier for foreign trained health professionals. We have strict rules on, for example, when someone who is earned their medical degree abroad has to go through a US residency before they can practice as a doctor in the United States, even if they'd been practicing 20 years in another country. Nursing credentials don't necessarily transfer from state to state, much less from international to domestic. So, thinking about the ways that maybe some people who are refugees coming in could get their credentials recognized to be more accessible to some of these jobs. Are those kinds of some of the things you're thinking about as well?
Oh yeah, absolutely. All that's very important. And when it comes to helping workers find the right job and obtain those skills necessary for the careers that they want to pursue, refugee, immigrant, native born, the US does not really have a coherent strategy. It's just a bunch of different programs associated with different safety nets. So UI has a reemployment and workforce development system. Food stamps has and SNAP, or I don't know what SNAP stands for, but it's food stamps.
Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program. I know
Right.
that
That's
one.
that's right. Yeah. They have a workforce development component. I would assume that there's a workforce development and employment matching component when you enter the US as an immigrant. And then we have this big umbrella law called the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act that just kind of covers a whole range of things. And so what we're really missing is a more coherent, what are the different situations people can fall under, and how can the US apply reskilling or a pathway for folks to find those jobs.
Yeah. So before we leave, I want to take note. Two Republican governors, Governor Eric Holcomb of Indiana and Governor Spencer Cox of Utah, wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post on February 21st, calling on Congress to, quote, end its decade standoff on setting immigration policy, unquote, and let states sponsor immigrants based on the needs of their communities. What are your overall thoughts on this idea? It seems like the governors are saying, "Hey, we've got shortages." It said it in the email, like in the op-ed. We have shortages in the state that we can't even train our own people enough to deal with. We need more immigrants.
So my impression of that is it would potentially in some areas be a positive step forward. Ideally, my view is that a federal strategy is always best with these things. Obviously, the benefit of this approach is that states, governors, they have the best sense for what their local communities need. Labor
Mhm.
markets are very diverse across the country, and the industries are different. The occupations that employers are looking to fill are different. And so you think that like the closer you get to the ground there, that they'd have a better sense of what they need. For me, one of my hesitations would be though is that, you know, as you know, this country has very different views of immigration policy, and so we
Mm,
might have some states with a lot of immigrants, some states with very few immigrants, and we could have growing disparities in that regard.
yeah. I mean, it's interesting. I think there's probably pros and cons to this approach. I I've done a lot of work with Canada, and we actually did some research looking at the Canadian system, and in Canada, they have this kind of provincial sponsorship model in addition to the federal, immigration system, so it's sort of an add-on, and it's worked very well for them. So, there may be opportunities to look at these in various ways. But that is all the time we have for today. Ben Gittes, thank you so much for joining us and providing a huge download on labor economics and labor policy in the United States. Thanks for joining This Week in Immigration.
Thank you for having me.
And that's it for our show this week. One last reminder to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform, and share it with your friends and colleagues. You can also find more information on all the issues we discuss here on the show at bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. You can follow the Bipartisan Policy Center on Twitter at BPC_bipartisan. You can follow me on Twitter at BPC_TBrown, and Ben Gittes is at Ben, Gitis on Twitter. For feedback or questions about this podcast, you can contact us by emailing immigration@bipartisanpolicy.org. I'm Teresa Cardinal Brown. This Week in Immigration was created and executive produced by me. This week's episode was written by Natalie Butler and me. Our audio editor is Joshua Joe. The executive producer of BPC Podcasts is Lucy Manning. See you next time on This Week in Immigration.